The offer arrived the way most irresistible offers do. Quietly, confidently, as if refusal had never been considered. By the time the script reached Anthony Hopkins, it had already acquired momentum. Studio interest. A director with heat. A role that came with language people liked to use when they wanted an actor to feel chosen. Career-defining. Prestige. A sure thing. Hopkins read the script alone, late at night, glasses low on his nose, pencil resting on the arm of his chair. He didn't skim. He never skimmed. He moved slowly, sentence by sentence, feeling for rhythm, intention, honesty. On paper it was impressive. Big themes. Strong dialogue. A central character designed to dominate the screen. The kind of role other actors would have said yes to before finishing the third page. Hopkins finished it. He closed the script and felt nothing. That was the first warning. It wasn't that the role was bad. It was well written, even elegant in places. Promised attention. Promised respect. It promised the kind of visibility that reinforced momentum at exactly the right moment in a career. But it didn't ask anything of him he hadn't already given before. The character was loud where Hopkins preferred quiet. Certain where Hopkins had learned to value uncertainty. The arc resolved cleanly, neatly, too neatly. It was a role that would work. That was the problem. The next morning his agent called. "They want an answer quickly," the agent said, barely containing enthusiasm. "They're building around you." Hopkins listened. "It's the role everyone wants right now," the agent continued. "You'd be mad to pass." Hopkins smiled faintly. "That's often when I'm most alert." There was a pause on the line. "You don't like it?" the agent asked. "I respect it," Hopkins said. "I don't recognize myself in it." "That's acting," the agent replied. Hopkins shook his head, even though the agent couldn't see him. "No," he said. "That's performing." The distinction mattered to him. It always had. The agent tried another angle. "You could elevate it." Hopkins considered that. "I don't want to carry something that doesn't want to walk on its own." Silence again. "You know what you're turning down?" the agent asked gently now. "Yes," Hopkins said. "Something that will look very good on paper." The agent sighed. "People will ask why." "They always do," Hopkins replied. The conversation ended politely, unresolved. Word traveled fast. Producers reached out. The director sent a thoughtful note. The studio followed up with assurances, rewrites, flexibility, creative control. All the usual levers were pulled, all the right words offered. Hopkins listened to them all. He declined every time. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just clearly. Behind the scenes, disbelief hardened into frustration. Why would someone at his stage turn down a role like that? Friends asked him privately. Some were supportive, others confused. "It's exactly the kind of thing you should be doing right now," one colleague said. Hopkins nodded. "Exactly." Another actor, less established, hungrier, was more blunt. "I'd kill for that part." Hopkins looked at him kindly. "That's why you should have it." The comment wasn't arrogance. It was accuracy. The role went to someone else. The film was made. And when it was released, it did exactly what Hopkins had predicted. It succeeded. Strong reviews. Award buzz. Industry chatter. The actor who took the role became inseparable from it for a while. Interviews, profiles, roundtables dissecting his performance. Hopkins watched none of it. He was working elsewhere on a smaller project that barely registered in the trades. A quiet character. Minimal dialogue. A story that unfolded slowly and didn't explain itself. People noticed the contrast. "You could have been everywhere right now," someone said to him at a dinner. Hopkins smiled. "I am," he said. "Just not loudly." The industry, however, is rarely patient. As years passed, the role Hopkins had turned down became a reference point. People brought it up in interviews, often framed as curiosity, sometimes as caution. "Any regrets?" they asked. Hopkins always answered the same way. No. They didn't believe him. From the outside, the decision looked reckless, counterintuitive, even self-sabotaging. The role he declined became shorthand for a path not taken, one that might have led to bigger budgets, more visibility, broader influence. What no one saw was what that path would have required him to give up. Hopkins had learned early that careers were shaped less by what you accepted than by what you refused. Saying yes created momentum. Saying no created direction. The role he turned down would have defined him for a decade. It would have made him familiar in a way that flattened curiosity. Audiences would have expected variations of the same energy, the same authority, the same tone. He knew this because he'd seen it happen to others. Actors who became trapped inside their most celebrated performances. Men who spent the rest of their careers negotiating with ghosts of roles they could never fully escape. Hopkins wanted no ghosts. He wanted work that aged with him, not work that froze him in place. Years later, when the film was discussed in retrospectives, people began to notice something strange. It hadn't aged particularly well. What once felt powerful now felt loud. What once felt definitive now felt dated. The performance that had been praised for its certainty began to feel fixed, immovable, and flexible. Hopkins' quieter work, meanwhile, began to surface in unexpected ways. Roles that hadn't been celebrated loudly at release gained gravity over time. Scenes people hadn't noticed at first began to linger longer in memory. A younger critic wrote once, "Hopkins seems uninterested in winning moments. He's building something slower." That was closer to the truth than most realized. When Hopkins was finally asked years later by someone who genuinely wanted to understand why he'd turned down the role everyone wanted, he answered without drama. "Because it was already finished," he said. The interviewer blinked. "Finished?" "Yes," Hopkins replied. "It didn't need me. It needed an audience." The interviewer pressed. "And what did you need?" Hopkins considered the question carefully. "Time," he said. "And silence. And uncertainty. Those weren't things the role offered." The decision had cost him in the short term. Fewer headlines. Less momentum. More questions than answers. But it had given him something else. Freedom from repetition. Freedom from expectation. Freedom to surprise himself again. The role everyone wanted had come and gone. Hopkins remained. And the real reason he never regretted turning it down had nothing to do with success or failure. It had to do with the simple fact that years later he was still curious. Still unboxed. Still unfinished. The role would have ended something. He had chosen to keep going. And the meaning of that choice would only become clearer with time, when the career paths diverged far enough for the difference to be unmistakable. That realization, however, belonged to the second half of the story. The divergence didn't announce itself. Never does. Careers don't split cleanly into right and wrong paths. They drift. They separate slowly, almost politely, until one day you look back and realize the distance between them is wider than you expected. The actor who took the role Hopkins declined rode it hard for several years. The performance became his calling card. Interviewers asked about it endlessly. Directors referenced it in meetings. Audiences expected that version of him every time he appeared on screen. At first that felt like power. Then it began to feel like repetition. Scripts started arriving that echoed the same authority, the same emotional temperature, the same certainty. Variations on a theme that no longer required discovery, only execution. The actor did his job well, sometimes brilliantly, but the work stopped surprising him. Hopkins watched none of this directly. He was busy doing something else, something quieter and far less efficient by Hollywood standards. He took roles that didn't come with guarantees. Parts that were smaller, stranger, occasionally misunderstood. Characters who didn't explain themselves and didn't ask to be admired. Some films passed almost unnoticed. Others found their audience slowly, years later, through rewatches and rediscovery. What connected them wasn't acclaim. It was durability. Hopkins' performances didn't peak quickly. They settled. They stayed. Directors who worked with him during that period noticed something unusual. He arrived with no interest in recreating past success. No attachment to what audiences thought he was good at. He approached each role as if nothing had come before it. That made him difficult to categorize. And invaluable. One director admitted years later, "You couldn't sell him on scale. Only on truth." The industry eventually caught up. The role Hopkins had turned down faded into a reference point rather than a benchmark. A successful film, yes, but no longer a defining one. Meanwhile, Hopkins' body of work began to look less like a collection of performances and more like a long conversation. About aging. About restraint. About the space between words. Critics began using phrases like late mastery and accumulated gravity, not because Hopkins had reinvented himself, but because he hadn't allowed himself to be fixed. That was the real consequence of saying no. He had refused to let one role decide the questions he was allowed to ask afterward. Late in his career, during a small retrospective event, someone finally asked him the question without framing it as regret. "When you look back," the interviewer said, "do you see that decision as a turning point?" Hopkins considered it. "No," he said. "I see it as a pause." "A pause from what?" "From momentum," Hopkins replied. "Momentum is useful, but it's dangerous if you confuse it with direction." The room was quiet. "You didn't want to be carried," the interviewer said. Hopkins nodded. "I wanted to walk." That was as close as he came to explaining it publicly. In private, he was more candid. To a friend over dinner, he once said, "The hardest thing isn't turning down a role everyone wants. It's turning down the version of yourself everyone is comfortable with." Comfort, he'd learned, was a subtle trap. Didn't feel like compromise. Felt like success. Until it wasn't. The reason the decision made sense years later wasn't because Hopkins avoided failure. It was because he avoided certainty too early. He kept his career porous, open to change, open to doubt, open to the possibility that the most interesting work hadn't arrived yet. That openness is rare. Most people close doors to feel safe. Hopkins left them ajar to keep breathing. By the time younger actors began asking him for advice, he no longer spoke about specific roles. He spoke about rhythm. "Pay attention to what repeats too easily," he told one. "If you stop being afraid, check whether you've stopped listening," he told another. When asked directly about the role he turned down, now safely distant, stripped of urgency, he smiled. "It did exactly what it was meant to do," he said. "Just not with me." There was no bitterness in his voice. No defensiveness. Only acceptance. Because the truth was simple. That role had belonged to a moment. Hopkins had chosen a continuum. He had traded immediate clarity for long-term coherence. He had accepted less certainty in exchange for more longevity. And in doing so, he built a career that didn't rely on peaks, but on accumulation. The path he didn't take ended cleanly. The one he did take stayed open. That was why, years later, the decision finally made sense. Not as a bold refusal, but as a quiet alignment with the kind of artist he wanted to remain. Not defined. Not contained. Not finished. Anthony Hopkins didn't turn down the role everyone wanted, because he thought he was above it. He turned it down because he knew what it would cost him later. And the rarest wisdom of all is not knowing when to say yes, but knowing when a no preserves the future. That was the end of the story. Not with applause. Not with vindication. But with a career that stayed alive long after the noise faded. And that, in the end, was worth far more than being right in the moment.